I have a new article out on Offbeat Research. If you guys want to go read it, it's about the situation around Pokrovsk. It's me with a grad artillery team in one of the villages that has since been taken over. And I give my perspective on, where do we stand with the Battle of Pokrovsk, what's led to this point, where the breakthrough happened, why the breakthrough happened. I also give some testimony from some other crews that I interviewed from other places that were there during the Battle of Soldove, and like the complications of what caused the Ukrainian units to be pushed back, as well as an on-the-ground perspective with a grad rocket crew that was, fighting near the Pokrovsk front. Anyway, it's quite long actually. I mean, relatively long, I would say, for just a quick breakdown. I think it gives a good perspective on the general situation, tying in a lot of testimony from the men themselves. So if you want to go check it out, it'd be cool. It's got some pictures in there. They also got the rights to some footage, so I think they're going to be playing or posting some footage in the near future. Either way, go check out the article. I think it's pretty good. I think it's good. Putting aside the article, which you should all read at Offbeat Research, Russia bets on Pokrovsk's push as resistance stiffens by Dylan Burns. I want to talk about the situation as is. So, as I talk about in this article, the situation in front of the city of Pokrovsk itself has stiffened on this side right here. It has generally stiffened. For a while, ever since Avdiivka fell, the Russians have been advancing, and they've been advancing quite fast for the last year and a half of conflict. And you can see in some weeks they were making as much as 10 kilometers a day. I mean, not a day, a week. Which, compared to what they want at the start of the war, still a far cry from what they wanted, but it's still much faster than what we were getting for much of 2023. Now, this was worsened in a few situations. For example, the breakthrough in Arachne did not help. There's a few other instances that I highlight, but this is not only bad for the situation in Pokrovsk, and as you can see on the left side of Pokrovsk right now, it's under increasing pressure as Soldove being captured is being utilized to target the villages to the south of Pokrovsk, which means that Pokrovsk is going to have to deal with pressure both from the east and from the south, which puts it in a less than favorable defensive position. But it also puts positions to the south at risk. And this was most clearly shown through the fall of what was really known as the Fortress of Volodar, where the 72nd took out Russian unit after Russian unit and really clocked whole divisions, causing immense Russian losses as tons and tons and tons of Moscow's armor was burnt outside of Volodar. But the 72nd was not replenished. The manpower restrictions became too much to bear, and the overbearing pressure and repeated assaults eventually led to Volodar falling. And this was caused not only by the same people who have been attacking from the south for forever, but also from this new push from out east that was caused by other Donetsk-related villages falling in the path there. The manpower shortage and ammunition shortage from earlier this year that caused the fall of Avdiivka had a reverberating effect and compounded pre-existing issues, which led not only to the city of Pokrovsk now being very, very close to the Russian front line. I mean, we're talking about from the closest point, 8 kilometers now, where the Russians could now shell the city for this coal hub and metallurgic hub for the Ukrainian armed forces and logistical hub, and is also leading to the loss of positions down south, including the fall of Volodar, and now, excuse these positions, which are already in a very difficult position. Kharkov right now has Russian fighting on the streets. You can see Russian infantry in the city center. Ukrainians will be pulling out in the near future. Now we are seeing Vasilya-Novosilka under immense pressure. And this right here should be setting off massive alarm bells. The villages around it fell quite quickly, But Vasilya is supposed to be a defensive strong point for the Ukrainians. The way that defenses are set up around here is that the defenses to the south of these villages and different defensive points were built up quite significantly, or have been built up at least somewhat, in order to confront a possible Russian attack north to try to take the city of Zaporizhia, or some intermediary goals like, for example, the smaller city of Orihov, which I have been in on many occasions. But the problem has been that the Russians had to slam in to the strength of Ukrainian positions that have been fortified here. But if these positions are getting flanked from not only the south being attacked, but also from the east, as Vasilya, one of these places that have been built up defensively from the south, that would be a very difficult position for the Russians to attack if they were attacking from these southern positions, is much easier to attack for the Russians by flanking it from the east. And as you can see here, the Russians have reached the outskirts of Vasilya, which is supposed to be one of the linchpins of the Ukrainian defense in Zaporizhia. Now, if Vasilya falls, which, by the way, I've seen the Russian armor approaching Vasilya, getting taken out by drones, being taken out, infantry being taken out by other munitions. But right now, they're on the outskirts. Russian drones are hitting different Ukrainian communication equipment, as you can see here. They're taking out Ukrainian vans and vehicles that are transporting troops, destroying, targeting the Ukrainians so that they cannot freely move around here, and are now contesting it. They're contesting it, and they shouldn't even be contesting it. And they certainly should not be contesting it from the direction that they are contesting it. But this is part of the consequence of the situation in Donetsk degrading and deteriorating as much as it has. And while I, spent a lot of time writing about the push for Pokrovsk, Pokrovsk's history and why the Russians would want it and what led to the situation, it's not that all these positions are isolated. The front line in Ukraine is gigantic. It's a very, very massive front line. And so the problem for the entirety of 2023 for the Russians as they were trying to advance, and for the Ukrainians when they launched the counteroffensive down south that failed, is that both sides have been building up to defensive positions, they've been entrenching, and they've been mobilizing troops faster and faster, mobilizing their economy faster, trying to get artillery shells to the frontline positions, trying to get javelins and anti-tank munitions to the frontline, anti-army munitions to the frontline positions, get manpower to frontline positions, and stiffen the front line to stop the other side from advancing, both for strategic, tactical, and political reasons. But once one of these positions actually starts to fall down, it's not that, okay, one domino has fallen. Once one domino falls, like, for example, Volodar, as we can see here, it fell because Donetsk was under increased pressure, and it being flanked on two sides on top of the manpower constraints was just too much. And so now Volodar falls, and that was supposed to, that's right outside of Donetsk, being affected by the fighting in Donetsk, that's now spilling over into Vasilya. Vasilya falls, and then you're talking about not only flanking this defensive position, but you're talking about flanking all these defensive positions down here. Why couldn't the Russians push here and then try to do the same thing in Hule-Pole, another defensive linchpin for the Ukrainian forces, and also the home of famous Ukrainian anarchist revolutionary Batko Ivanovich Makhno? So what I'm trying to say is none of these battles are in isolation. They all spill into each other. And so once Donetsk starts crumbling, or southern Donetsk especially starts crumbling after the fall of Avdiivka and then Volodar, which is technically Zaporizhia, but it adds more pressure to southern Donetsk as well as this area in Zaporizhia, which then leads to these breakthroughs in Donetsk, causing breakthroughs in Zaporizhia. And then once those spill over, then you start talking about the city of Zaporizhia. What danger is the city of Zaporizhia in? Because if these defensive positions can be flanked, people start having the doomsday talks of, what if Zaporizhia gets an artillery range? What if these defensive positions fall down, get flanked, Ukraine pulls back due to the manpower shortage, and now they have to defend the city of Zaporizhia, a city that is, full of hundreds of thousands of people within artillery range, causing more mass displacement, which is not just going to affect Ukraine. It's not just going to affect Zaporizhia. It's also going to affect the countries that are going to have to take in more refugees. And some of the countries that are having ministers, like the former financial minister in Germany, Lichtner, who got removed and collapsed the traffic light coalition, those that are fearful of taking on any debt to support Ukraine, those are the countries that are going to take the majority of the blow when it comes to future refugee displacement. And I'm just trying to be for real with you guys right now, that this is the situation we're talking about when it comes to Zaporizhia. I'm not saying it's reached that point. I am saying that one of the defensive linchpins for Zaporizhia has reached that point, has reached the point that it's being attacked on two sides. And unless there is some amount of reserves gathered by the Ukrainians to stiffen Vasilino Vasilka and try to preserve the situation, then it's going to get more difficult here before it gets easier. Now, mind you, these reserves are needed at many other locations. There's an argument to deploy them just about anywhere. Of course, Vasilino Vasilka, you'd be defending the flank of the Zaporizhia region while trying to contain the spillover of this Donetsk advances. While you could also make an argument to put it in Kurakove, because right now the Russians have reached the city center, and if you want to buy more time for defensive positions to stiffen around Pokrovsk, one of the prerequisites the Russians probably have before really trying any major attacks on Pokrovsk is probably going to be capturing this, so its flank isn't constantly getting shelled and bombed by Ukrainian tanks like this, and Ukrainian positions and Ukrainian shelling and Ukrainian drone attacks, because right now their advance is getting flanked. There's also a good argument to be made about putting it around Pokrovsk. As you can see, they're not just going to be attacked from out east here, but they're now being flanked on the south. And if you were to stop this southern advance from spreading further, then you would put Pokrovsk in a more defensible position, therefore preserving parts of Donetsk that, the Russians really want to take, the Ukrainians really want to defend, especially if they want to stop the battle from Kramatorsk and Sloviansk from becoming a thing. And if these cities fall and they advance in this direction, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about moving towards the battle for Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Also, it's a logistical line for Toretsk, which is a battle that's still going on right now as the Russians have entered the city center of Toretsk. It's a supply line for the city of Chasiv Yar, which is another place you could argue that a deployment could be made to, because as you can see, the Russians have clearly crossed the canal. They are in the city of Chasiv Yar. They've crossed the canal. They have entered the residential blocks, and they're moving block by block deeper and deeper into the city. They're also trying to flank Chasiv Yar, both from the south down here, even though they've kind of gotten a little bit held up, and they're trying to advance above Chasiv Yar to the north. As you can see here, they're trying to get through the forest to try to pressure Chasiv Yar from as many directions as they can. And I was there about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and it was bad in Chasiv Yar. Right now in Chasiv Yar, it is hell on earth. The Russians had to step over the bodies of the dead in order to get over the dam. The Ukrainians would not be able to sustain the type of losses that the Russians did to push forward in Chasiv Yar. Western armies would never swallow these types of losses to accept an advance here in Chasiv Yar, but the Russians are perfectly willing to. And so Chasiv Yar is another place that one could argue, hey, some troops here could help stiffen the line and stop that fight from moving on to other cities. And after Chasiv Yar, we're talking about Konstantinivka. And I've spent a lot of time in Konstantinivka. There's a lot of civilians in Konstantinivka. Konstantinivka is a logistical way that supports Toretsk. And if we have Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, if we have Pokrovsk falling and Konstantinivka falling, there's no holding Toretsk. There's no holding any of these southern cities or villages here. So any of these positions could use troop redeployments. There's an argument for troop redeployments into Seversk. I'm not saying that these are all the same level of priority. I'm just saying these are all places that need troops. If there's a place on the front line, it needs troops. Where's another place that could arguably use troops right now? Up here in Kupiansk. The Russians have made assaults into the city of Kupiansk. Reports indicate that they were pushed out of the city of Kupiansk, but that means if they can get into the city of Kupiansk, that they are close to the city of Kupiansk. 6 months ago, this was not the discussion we're having. 6 months ago, we were talking about the Russians reaching the Oskil River. The Russians have reached the Oskil River. This is the Oskil River. Here they are. Here they are. They've reached it, and they've started pushing north, and they've started pushing south. Now, the reason why this situation is bad is that if the Russians continue to push into Kupiansk and they take it, not only are they taking the east side of the city that the Ukrainians recaptured during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, taking back the hard-fought victories that the Ukrainians took at a stage of the war that is not returning when it comes to Russian manpower shortages, at least not anytime soon. Not only would it lose that, but it could then use this as a railway and a supply line down south and put another pressure on the Donetsk region, not just from the east, not just from the south, which is expanding more and more and more, but then from the north, which means that the Donetsk region would be pressed from three directions. They would be fighting a three-front battle. So the Ukrainians have incentives to keep Kupiansk and to keep the Russians busy up here as long as possible, to not only build up defenses, but also to stop them from having a three-front advance. So there is a good argument to redeploy troops here and say, oh, let's try with whatever strength we have to try to maybe counterattack here and push them back away from the Oskil River, or try to reinforce Kupiansk so the Russians cannot advance into the city and make that defense more costly for them. These are all areas that you could argue that could use troop redeployments. Volchansk is probably a lower priority, but I mean, those troops, of course, would appreciate support. But in Kursk, you could very much make an argument that they need troop redeployments. While the troops in Kursk have been offered a pay raise, and there is an over $300,000 compensation that the government has announced for the families of those who lose their loved ones fighting in Kursk, Kursk is under tremendous pressure. The Ukrainians in Kursk have lost about 40% of the land that they originally captured from Russia during the Kursk incursion earlier this year. Now, most of this land that they were losing were not the most super defendable positions. It was the Ukrainians stretching out to the length of where their advance would go, testing the Russians, how far they could be pushed, and then from the extent of that being pushed back into more defensible positions. But it is undeniable that, the Ukrainians were at the outskirts of Kornevo. Months and months and months ago, we were talking about a potential battle for Kornevo. They pushed them out, reclaimed these villages, and are now fighting for these ones. So they have reclaimed villages. They pushed the Ukrainians out of Snagnos. They pushed Ukrainians out of this village, out of this village, out of this village. They've retaken about 40%. Now, mind you, that still means the majority of what the Ukrainians have taken are still being occupied by the Ukrainians. That's the plus side. On the other side, though, the Russians are increasingly adding more and more and more pressure because their political demands are still obvious here. And as much as we talk about like war from a tactical and strategic level, even if the Ukrainians make the casualty burn for the Russians in this area positive towards overall war aims, war is an extension of politics, Clausewitz. And so if the Russians want to achieve something by a certain date, say push the Ukrainians out of Kursk by January 20th before any potential negotiation could take place with the incoming Trump administration, therefore eliminating Ukrainian leverage before negotiations had even begun, then them taking a higher casualty rate and a higher vehicle loss rate in order to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk for their goals might be worth it. It's still a question as to whether they're going to achieve that. I've heard from some insider publications like War on the Rocks and others that they think that the Ukrainians are probably going to be pushed out of Kursk in the near future. I think it would depend on what we mean by in the near future, because if we're talking in the near future means April and May, and if they were able to keep up this rate of attacks, then I would say that that's likely. But if we're saying January 20th and, you know, stopping that rate of attack by then because they just can't keep it up because it costs too much in lives and material, then I'm much more divided. I really do not know. There are some that are adamant that the Ukrainians have the ability to defend this, mostly those, of course, in the Ukrainian Armed Forces Command, while there are others in the Ukrainian Armed Forces that are sounding alarms about the amount of men and material that's being gathered against them, including VDV units, of course, the North Korean soldiers that were redeployed into the Kursk region earlier this year. I mean, like the last month or two, all these North Korean troops have been redeployed. And even if these troops are not used in offensive operations and they're just used in defensive line-holding operations, that frees other Russian soldiers up to engage in offensive operations, because instead they would have to hold the line, but now they could just concentrate on attacking. And the number we heard before was 50,000 soldiers in this area. Now the number I'm hearing is 60,000 soldiers in this area. That's a lot of men. That's a lot of material. And they really are trying to push the Ukrainians out. And I heard from one testimony, let me see if I can read this, or if I can drag this out here. This is from yesterday. This is from a Ukrainian soldier in the armed services serving right now, describing his experience in Kursk. In the nearest future, we expect a massive, and in my humble opinion, successful Russian advance at my flank in Kursk region. 2 Russian VDV divisions, 1 VDV brigade, and 1 Marine brigade will launch an assault with a lot of maneuvers. Now, this might end up not being true, because they're saying we expect this. It might also be that they represent one niche part of the Kursk front, this soldier's perspective, where he represents, say, as an example, not saying this is the case, he's right here, whereas the positions over here are much better, the positions over here are much better. We don't know, but I am hearing about harder and harder and harder and harder attacks. This is the one account I've heard where they're talking about we expect success. So I haven't found a lot of others that are saying that. But the rate of attacks are increasing. The amount of men that are being used is increasing. And the reports from Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk is that they're under increased pressure. So I think right now the Russians are trying to utilize the moment, try to take advantage of this window they have until January to try to remove Ukrainian leverage, which is why I could also understand, even though it's not fighting for Ukrainian land, considering how hard the Russians are pushing and how they're going to have to be in some way dismissive of casualties for that. So it's an opportunity to, really damage your opponent, as well as the fact that this is useful for potential, or at least potentially useful for Ukrainian negotiated leverage. It would make sense for the government in Kyiv to want to redeploy troops to this front, to this area, making it another location that would make sense for the Ukrainians to redeploy troops to. And so to be clear, the Ukrainians could use troop shipments to Kursk, they could use troop shipments to Kupiansk, they could use troop shipments to Chasiv Yar, they could use troop shipments towards Toretsk, they could use troop shipments towards Pokrovsk, they could use troop shipments towards Korayhove, they could use troop shipment, and they could certainly use troop shipments towards Vasilino-Vasilka. That's not even talking about the rumors of a potential Russian attack down south, which, if they're also pushing from the east, is going to be a problem. The situation right now is difficult. Now, everything I've said right now, very little of it has been positive. Now, I can throw out the positive thing that I always think is implied, but I should get right off the bat. This is at incredibly high losses. And while in recent reports have indicated that the Russians have been able to, generally speaking, regenerate the forces that they're expending, therefore they're losing about 25,000 men a month, they recruit about 25,000 men a month. While 25,000 men a month is horrific in comparison to, say, like Vietnam, the Russians have, to some extent, normalized this. in their society. So judging it on
Kazim got a tier 3 subscription.
Wow.
Asterisk, 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 Putin. All my homies hate Putin.
Thank you so much for the tier 3 sub. You could have done tier 1, could have done tier 2. You went all the way to tier 3. Thank you so much, Kazim. I appreciate that. They've normalized the rate of losses, and if they're able to regenerate it, then at least their force is not reducing. Now, when I say that, that excludes questions of experience, because if you lose a bunch of experienced tank commanders, putting new guys in a tank and saying attack is not the same thing. But when it comes to just sheer mass of people for these attacks and doom buggies, these attacks and motorcycles, all these small infantry attacks on the line, finding a crack in the line with some TDF unit, some territory defense forces, then hitting it hard, trying to punch through the line, you're going to need a lot of men to do that. And they are replenishing the men. But recently, the losses have been so high that I think that they might, if they haven't already, but risk to in the near future, sliding back into a rate that is, they're losing more men than they are recruiting, which would make sense. If they're trying to push the Ukrainians out by January 20th, and they're fighting under the assumption that the fighting very well could be done come January or March, and both sides are trying to jostle for the best possible position, it would make sense that the Russians would speed up the pressure, which comes at a higher cost, which comes at a higher burn rate. Now, will this manifest before January 20th? Probably not in a massive way, maybe in small ways, but not in a massive way. Maybe when it comes to the experience of the men that are doing the assaults, that could manifest probably sooner. But long term, let's say the war does not end January 20th. Let's say negotiations fall through and the United States continues aid for any number of reasons. Let's say Marco Rubio is actually God tier at Trump whispering, and Mark Rutte, knows how to be smooth and suave enough, and Zelensky makes a good enough deal and offer. This is the type of stuff that could very much hurt the Russians if come January, February, the war's not over. It's now going to be, who knows, like another year, and they've got to find a way to make up that manpower. Because right now, the way they're making up the manpower is recruiting from prisons like crazy, pulling from other areas, whether that be Kaliningrad, the Africa Corps, etc., the Wagner's Africa Corps, or massive payouts. I remember I was talking to Bogdan, my fixer, about the payouts that the Russians are offering soldiers, and he didn't believe them. I was like, no, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars here for first-time signs. Yes. No, we're talking massive amounts these regional governments trying to hit these recruitment numbers are offering. Amounts that are not sustainable, and we don't know how much they could continue to increase. This is all on top of domestic economic pressures the Russians have been experiencing and has been worsening rapidly. With all these price controls, we still have the ruble worth less than a penny right now. And the situation's only getting worse. We have people stealing butter out of Russian grocery stores as inflation goes up. And the Russians are now set to increase interest rates again to 23% come December to try to get a hang on the situation. Right now, it seems that Russian strategy and planning is around the election. Post-election, a lot of this could come back to bite them if Ukraine is rejuvenated with the recruitment stuff that they are engaging in through the winter. That means new recruitment policies implemented, new recruits being trained and finally deployed, combined with revigorated aid. But of course, these are all factors that we cannot control for. We don't know how negotiations are going to go. We don't know if negotiations fall through, if the United States will continue with aid. And quite frankly, considering the Ukrainian record on recruitment, we don't know how recruitment is going to go or what the quality of those recruits are going to be, the rates of desertion that will be amongst those recruits, because desertion rates has increased in the Ukrainian armed forces. And I've seen it firsthand, not only just in, anecdotal examples. Well, that is an anecdotal example if I've seen it firsthand, but I've seen it firsthand. And the amount of desertion cases have increased in the criminal justice system. So it depends on a bunch of factors that I just cannot determine 100% right now. If I knew that this was going to last into 2026, and I could determine American aid into the future, and I could determine that they are going through with these recruitment policies, then I could say, this is how it's going to bite the Russians in the ass in a year from now. But because the war very well might end in the next few months, even though it might not be on terms that anyone is necessarily expecting or wanting. It's impossible for me to say exactly what the long-term effects of this is going to be until we see what happens January 20th. For now, all we can say is the Russians are trying to prepare the field for January 20th negotiations. The Ukrainians are under increasing pressure, and the Russians are doing everything they can to see where they can get the Ukrainians to break. Whether the Ukrainians do break, we have yet to see. Maybe winter will provide them a respite. I'll say that I went down to Kherson. We filmed interviews about the human safari, came back to Kiev, and there was snow on the ground, and it's been cold ever since. December is coming around the corner. December is almost here, and Jack Frost is nipping at our noses. So that will also likely disincentivize the attacker, but the Russians have attacked through the winter before. Giving their soldiers some frostbite in order to keep on the pressure, I think, is something the Russians would be more than willing to do. So we will see. Okay, there you go. There is my analysis of the frontline situation.